destructive sound, audible for miles around. The flying bomb could not take off under its own power. It was attached to a separately powered catapult. Fuel was injected into the catapult and ignited by an electric spark. The expanding gases drove the catapult up the ramp. This accelerated the bomb to its takeoff speed. After it left the end of the ramp, the catapult dropped away and the bomb's own engine took over. On Christmas Eve 1942, the first flying bomb carrying explosives was tested. When the missile reached its target, having traveled a preset distance, a simple device in the nose cut off the fuel with a final rattle. While the Luftwaffe's flying bomb was heading towards operational readiness, another team at Peenemünde was still struggling. This rocket was to be the most elaborate means of delivering an explosive charge yet devised. The superstructure was repeatedly tested in the supersonic wind tunnel over many months to ensure it was aerodynamically perfect. The case concealed a jigsaw of 22,000 separate components. But because of its sophisticated design, the rocket itself was remarkably light, consisting of only 4 tons of metal. A totally new type of fuel, liquid oxygen and alcohol, was to drive the engine. Technicians were assembling a rocket far taller than any yet known. It stood at around 46 feet. By the summer of 1942, the engine, which consumed 2 enormous tanks of fuel in a single minute, was functioning perfectly on the test bed. The guidance system was a technological breakthrough based on the still novel science of electronics. After 2 unsuccessful launches, tension at Peenemünde reached a peak on the 3rd of October 1942. Another failure could mean the end of the research program. The gyroscopes, which would direct the rocket in flight, received their final tuning, the end of a long series of pre-launch checks. Von Braun and Dornberger chatted with the engine's design team. They knew their reputations were at stake. Liquid oxygen and alcohol were loaded into the fuel tanks. 1 minute after takeoff, the 13 tons of the A-4 reached a speed of almost 9,000 miles an hour. Hitler was no scientist, but a long-range weapon that could not be intercepted, he could understand. To Heino von Braun and his Peenemünde team, he sent a telegram of congratulation. The project was saved. Speer could now convince Hitler that the rocket program should become a top priority. The perfect offensive weapon, made for reprisals. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, paid Peenemünde 2 visits in the spring and summer of 1943. He and other leading Nazis were eager to associate themselves with a project that had Hitler's personal backing. But the rocket was still not ready for mass production, much less operational use. 65,000 modifications of the original plans had to be made. Deployment of the new weapons that had been promised to the Führer had to be postponed month after month. Clearly, there were still problems. While work on Hitler's secret weapons continued, a major building program was begun to prepare the sites where they would be stored and fired. In deference to Hitler's grandiose architectural ideas, the initial plan was to house the rockets and flying bombs in giant concrete bunkers. Another 4 bunkers with 96 smaller firing sites were planned for the flying bomb. These bunkers, named by the Germans special constructions, were on a huge scale, with walls and roofs of reinforced concrete nearly 16 feet thick. In the Pas-de-Calais, a system of support tunnels was prepared. On top of the tunnels was to be built a 60,000-ton concrete dome. This enormous structure was to conceal a massive room for the launching of 14 rockets at once. The construction program involved a host of workers, including hundreds of professional builders and surveyors. A flood of information, much of it on scraps of paper, now reached British intelligence. Every day, British reconnaissance aircraft flew above occupied Europe. All the evidence seemed to point to some connection between the mysterious sites being developed near the Channel coast and the even more sinister establishment at Peenemünde. Photographic cover was intensified. Dr. R.V. Jones of British Scientific Intelligence briefed his team to study every detail of every photograph. It paid off. Photographic proof of rockets at Peenemünde. A decision was immediately taken to launch a heavy raid by Bomber Command, Operation Hydra. On the evening of 17th of August 1943, 597 heavy bombers took off from Great Britain. Soon after midnight, Pathfinder crews marked the target with colored smoke. $1,600 tons of high explosive and 250 tons of incendiary bombs were dropped in an attack concentrated into only 45 minutes. The immediate military significance of the destruction was less than had been hoped. The Pathfinder indicators had been misplaced, and the main buildings were untouched. Most of the victims were foreign workers housed in a camp 3 miles away from what had been the main target. The real benefits of the raid on Peenemünde were indirect. The Germans now knew that the Allies had intelligence information about their weapons project. Fearing more raids, much of the testing previously carried out at Peenemünde had to be dispersed immediately. Rocket experiments were transferred to Blizna, a large SS camp in Poland. The timetable had suffered a short, but for the British valuable, delay. At Blizna, rockets were fitted with explosive warheads for the first time. Most of them blew up as they re-entered the atmosphere. The site was soon littered with wreckage. The tests were a disaster. But the pressure was on. An order for 12,000 rockets was placed by the Führer. With the war going badly for Germany, Hitler's hopes now rested on an untried weapon that had so far failed to work. Hitler now entrusted responsibility for mass production to Himmler's SS. The workforce must come from within the concentration camps. The prisoners were to dig 2 enormous tunnels linked by galleries, assembly lines for an underground factory. The factory was buried in the mountains at Nordhausen, central Germany. Working conditions were appalling. A few were able to record their experiences.
The smoking mouth of a monstrous tunnel. The clamor rises as we get closer. 2 rows of SS surround the entrance, shouting so loud, hitting so madly that they look like demons. It is no doubt the gates of hell. In order to get through the bottleneck, the mass rushes forward, stretches out, bends, arms flailing everywhere. Truncheons hit heads, rain on the back and the shoulders. Cries of pain mix with those of anger. The tunnel charges into the mountain, 9 meters wide, almost as high. Everywhere, grey-faced prisoners can be seen walking about, haggard and ragged, white with dust. Miserable creatures heaving along the rubble in cement bags, carrying boxes and girders. Next to the door of the gallery where we sleep, the corpses of the night are dragged from the blocks by the feet. Useless rubbish, which this hive of activity is ridding itself of.
prisoners were soon moved to living quarters above ground. Known as Dora, the camp was finished in the spring of 1944. It ultimately contained 32,000 men. Frenchmen, Belgians, Czechoslovaks, Poles, Russians. Many came from races which the Germans regarded as racially inferior, and all were treated with great brutality.
Very slowly. I'm so tired I couldn't do it any other way. I get dressed. I've become so slow in everything, except for suffering. Hunger is already a torture. It's only 5:30 in the morning. The soup will be distributed at 2 this afternoon, not before. Now it's time again for the code, the blows, the work, everything. And tomorrow will bring the same torture. And the day after too. And over again, every day for months to come. Wounds fester all over my body. There's nowhere to wash. No water in the tunnel. Anyway, if we do find some, we mustn't drink it. If we give way to the temptation, the dysentery gets worse. So there is always this constant thirst. Work never stops under the ground of the heart. Night and day, the underground world of Dora is busy with its horrid activity.
Those whose work was not thought adequate, either through sabotage or even fatigue, were executed on the spot, or, more publicly, outside at the next roll call.
All gagged, with a thick square stick across the mouth, tightened in the back by an iron thread. The metal bends and cuts the flesh. The eyes open wide. There is no cry, just astonishment.
In seiner Rede rechnet Adolf Hitler mit den Feinden Deutschlands ab.
Hitler's hopes of inflicting his revenge upon the Allies now rested almost entirely on his secret weapons. They featured increasingly in his speeches. At Munich, he told his audience that Germany would not lay down its arms as it did in 1918. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, shared his master's rage. He increasingly referred to the law of retaliation in kind and hinted that miracle weapons were under development which would turn the tide of war in Germany's favor. The German threats were taken seriously in London. British intelligence now suspected that there were not one but 2 secret weapons under development in Germany, and they might be almost ready for use. As well as giant bunkers already located, scores of smaller launch sites resembling skis on their sides were identified. The number was increasing almost daily. Their distinctive shape made them easy to detect on reconnaissance photographs. So too did their alignment. All were pointing towards London. The flying bomb. Churchill ordered Operation Crossbow. Its purpose? To destroy all suspect structures near the Channel coast. Day after day, the Allies attacked the giant bunkers and flying bomb bases. But the Allies lacked a crucial piece of information. The secret weapons were not there. The structures were now no more than decoys. The Germans had abandoned them months earlier. Hitler had decided to launch his flying bombs from lighter, prefabricated ramps, which could be erected in a few hours and were almost impossible to detect. June 1944, D-Day. Still no fire from the famous secret weapons. Those who had always doubted the reality of the threat seemed vindicated. But they had rejoiced too soon. As the world anticipated Hitler's defeat in the wake of the Normandy landings, his army of 6,500 well-trained launch specialists were awaiting his command. After months of waiting, the time had come for Hitler's revenge. On the night of the 15th of June 1944, 244 weapons were unleashed. Destination, London. The Reich Press was proud to announce that reprisal weapon number 1, Vergeltungswaffe 1, had entered into action. Although the official line in Britain was to discount its effects, the V1, or Doodlebug, was a serious and growing menace. 5,000 were launched in the first 36 days. Daily life over much of southern England. The Tall Boys, giant 5-ton bombs used in an attempt to destroy every suspected storage depot. Hitler's depots and storage bases made poor targets, but there was no choice. They simply bombed as many as they could find. In their own airspace, the British struggled with how to defend civilians from this new, elusive weapon. From mid-July, after initial confusion, a 3-tier system of defense was in operation. Along the coast were amassed thousands of guns. Many were directed by radar and fired shells with proximity fuses. Despite flying on a fixed course, the V1, thanks to its small size and high speed, proved an elusive target. But the rate of kills rapidly improved. Between the coast and the outskirts of London, the fighters had a free hand. In what became known as Doodlebug Alley, the fighters tried to shoot down the missiles over thinly populated countryside. Capital's third and last line of defense. Thousands of barrage balloons assembled along the North Downs. The cables formed a steel net in the sky, ready to ensnare bombs that had got through the artillery and the fighters. The flaming exhausts of the flying bombs made a striking sight after dark. They also provided a target for the defending gunners and fighters. But still the V1s got through. Throughout the summer of the Doodlebugs, night and day, every activity, however harmless and peaceful, was liable to be interrupted by sudden death and injury. Londoners took shelter as best they could. By the end of the summer, well over 2,000 doodlebugs had hit London, killing 6,000 people and destroying 32,000 homes. They had inflicted lesser damage on around 1 million families. But popular morale did not collapse. Southern England was sustained by the news of the Allied progress in France, which suggested that their ordeal would soon be over. Newsreel commentators tried to keep their tone bright.
Here it is, or what remains of it, called Doodlebug or Buzz Bomb. The pilotless plane with the explosive head is in fact the aerial torpedo. Used as it is by the enemy, it is completely blind, and as an indiscriminate weapon of terror, it
Rebels knew that Hitler had a further surprise in store for his enemies. A totally secret and totally mobile new way of launching a rocket. Fuel tanks, a command vehicle, and a specially designed transporter, the Meilerwagen, which could raise the rocket into the firing position. Only a small flat area was needed to set up a firing platform. The rocket's range made sites in northern France unnecessary. The Belgian Ardennes and The Hague, still in German hands, were quite near enough. On the evening of the 8th of September 1944, the era of the missiles began. The first two V-2 rockets to arrive in England landed in Chiswick in West London and Epping further to the northeast. Thereafter, the campaign built up steadily as General Kamler's men mastered their new trade, and it became clear that the British defences were powerless to stop them. A month later, Hitler gave the order to launch an offensive against Antwerp. The large Belgian port, through which most of the Allies' resources were distributed to the continent, was soon the target of a double V-1 and V-2 attack. It lasted for 3 months. The number of rockets arriving in England climbed week by week to nearly 10 a day. A miserable winter and the failure of the Allies to win the war by Christmas added to the gloom. Once fired, the rocket, travelling at 3 times the speed of sound, was invulnerable. There was no warning. Kammler, a fanatical Nazi, carried on firing rockets with Germany collapsing around him. The philosophy of Hitler kept him going. Revenge. While Kammler was directing the last stand of the rocket units, Peenemünde had been evacuated. The home of the most sophisticated weapons in Europe was threatened by the advance of foot-slogging Russian infantry. The engineers travelled across a Germany that had sunk into chaos. At the end of March, as the last V-2s were falling in London, the Dora Nordhausen factory was closed. On the 3rd of April, the camp was evacuated. Those prisoners who had survived its horrors now faced what became known as the Walk of Death. The weakest members were killed along the way. On the 11th of April, the Americans liberated the prisoners, too weak to move, who had been left behind at Nordhausen. Colonel Farriers was one of the liberators.
We belonged to the hardened and seasoned hospital troops, and we thought that we'd seen it all. Carrying a stretcher, we rushed to the nearest building. As soon as we get to the entrance, we're confronted by reality. Before our eyes lay rows of skeletons, just barely covered with skin. Men are lying, starving, with pallid coloring. Their striped outfits with their registration numbers are hanging from their bodies, the last vestiges of those who had enslaved or killed them. A Frenchman had collapsed on a dead companion, huddled up as if trying to keep him warm, not even realizing that his friend had died 2 or 3 days before, incapable of the slightest movement.
The remaining German inhabitants of Nordhausen were forced by the American soldiers to bury the dead in communal graves. More than 25,000 men perished by neglect or deliberate murder in producing 6,000 rockets in this one underground factory. 4 men dead for every rocket. Werner von Braun, his arm in a plaster cast after a car accident, gave himself up to the Americans on the 2nd of May 1945. He brought with him several tons of German technical archives. He was not prosecuted for alleged war crimes. The Americans decided that German knowledge and expertise were more important. Von Braun was recruited to White Sands Base, New Mexico. There his work culminated in the rocket which carried Neil Armstrong to the moon. Little consolation for the victims of Hitler's secret weapons.